Okay, I hope to encourage everyone to come back together, both here in the room and to recollect everyone's focus online. I want to introduce our next panel. And we're going to start with Judith Torney-Porta, who's the panel chair, who will make introductions of everyone who's worked on the panel and will present today.
Your red light isn't on.
Right there.
Oh.
Is that on? Good. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to introduce this afternoon's panel. Is this supposed to be me? No. Okay. All right, that's it. Beginning with our paper writers, Carolyn Barber is an educational psychologist and professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She brings more than 15 years of experience doing insightful analysis of the IEA Civic International Education Test and Survey data, along with other methodologies. The paper is co-authored by Chris Clark, who is standing at the podium here, who is currently Director of Social Studies Education at Northwestern State University in Oklahoma, and who has an article coming out in the Educational Researcher, so you have a preview of that.
It's already out. Came out last week.
Good. Carolyn will participate virtually while Chris is here with us. Now, to continue, our discussant, Dave Campbell, is the Professor of Political Science and Department Chair at the University of Notre Dame. He has studied political socialization among many other interests for several decades. Deanna Kuhn, who may be participating remotely, I don't know, is a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, and has some very interesting recent studies in particular of children's argumentative thinking, which fit right into our topic. Carol Hahn has a number of decades of both qualitative and quantitative research on civic education and civic discourse, and was the president of the National Council for the Social Studies. So they will be participating after I go ahead here. We're taking a slightly different approach. The paper focuses less on the history and more about this particular part of the Academy's project and its roots. That is discourse and discussion, especially as it takes place in the classroom. I believe that this project has done something that I was hoping was going to happen, which is to re-energize a field of study. About 50 years ago, political scientists and psychologists at the University of Chicago and the University of Michigan initiated survey research about political attitude development among children and adolescents. These researchers emphasized individual developmental processes and almost totally ignored school or classroom contexts or racial disparities. Simultaneously, at Indiana University, foresighted individuals were pointing to the importance of classroom climate. In the 1970s, in a collaboration largely involving Teachers College, Columbia, and Stockholm University, the first IEA civic education study was organized in 10 countries. The political socialization researchers, those studying classroom and school climates, and the civic education researchers never really addressed a common agenda. And they never sufficiently considered social contexts. So I believe that this session actually brings these topics together. Thanks to the foresight of Carol and others, we have the opportunity to re-energize this field with a generation of mid and early career scholars who are focused on civic reasoning and discourse. Carolyn and Chris's paper extends one important finding from decades of research. Students who report that their classes are characterized by openness in the classroom climate and a chance to explore ideas on which individuals have different viewpoints learn more about the civic and political realm and are also more accepting of group differences. Recent advances in developmental and learning sciences, methodological innovations, and the recognition of diverse community contexts allows researchers to explore how a broad set of environments situate young people's civic discourse. These civic learning environments are important components. I'm happy now to introduce Carolyn and Chris, and I will let them divide up the what is going to be said as they
Carolyn's
see
going to
fit.
start us off. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Judith. And thank you to the National Academy of Education for hosting this event. I'm going to ask Chris to run the slides here, so if you hear me say next slide throughout, that's why. As Judith mentioned in her introduction, we began our work with the understanding that the nature of the broader environment and climate in which civic reasoning and discourse skills are practiced matters greatly for civic development. My apologies, I'm still hearing a little bit of an echo out in the room. While relevant learning environments for this purpose could include any context in which learning happens, be it social, psychological, or physical, we are particularly interested in this presentation on the role of formal learning environments, schools, as well as the classrooms within them, because of the centrality of schooling to this larger project. There are several challenges in working from this key understanding, however. One is the acknowledgement that formal learning environments are nested within a broader social system, one that is constantly changing and continuing to expose social inequities and stark differences in how members of society perceive and address issues. While these issues are discussed in much greater depth in the social contexts paper, we acknowledge that any discussion of a learning environment needs to recognize the broader social context in which it is embedded. The second, and directly related to the first, is that students themselves come into the learning environment with their own unique backgrounds and, as a result, experience the learning environment in different ways. In this case, the climate of the learning environment is not only characteristic of an organization, but it is also something that is perceived individually. Our paper is organized around several questions that arose as our team began to wrap our minds around the charge of this project and the key issue presented here. In addressing our questions, we drew upon research from a variety of academic disciplines, including education, psychology, and political science. Our research base also draws from work conducted using a variety of methodological traditions, from large-scale international survey research to in-depth focused case studies of exemplary schools. We then end with a discussion of recommendations for research and practice. In our presentation today, I'll be discussing several of our key findings on how climates support civic reasoning and discourse before turning to Chris and DC, who will describe how these findings can be situated within larger social realities before discussing identified gaps in research and recommendations for further work in both research and practice. Next slide. The first key finding essentially follows from our key issue, and that is, we find a lot of evidence to suggest an association between open, positive climates in classrooms and schools and a variety of civic outcomes. These outcomes include skills as well as knowledge, current and intended participation in both conventional and social action-oriented domains, and attitudes, including notably support for the political and social rights of social groups who have historically experienced marginalization. In digging deeper into this key finding, however, I want to acknowledge the various features of the learning environment that fall under the general term of climate. By and large, the aspect of climate that we most often think of in relation to civic reasoning and discourse is the openness of a climate within a classroom for discussion of political and social issues, particularly when discussions result in students disagreeing with one another or with a teacher. This makes sense given the ways in which this aspect of climate connects directly to issues of pedagogy, as will be discussed in the pedagogy paper tomorrow. However, climate can and does also refer to other characteristics of the learning environment. One recurring feature is whether a school or a classroom has a shared understanding of norms among members of the community, and that includes students, staff, teachers, and administrators alike. Work that refers to the ethos of a school or ground rules for classroom discussion reflects this. Another is the presence of supportive relationships that provide a sense of safety and support for engaging in reasoning and discourse activities. These could be among students or between students and teachers. Bridging both of these points is the extent to which the climate of a school supports students using their voice, their reasoning, if you will, to inform and address issues both in the school and in the community at large. In short, when we talk about the role of climate, we may be talking about many different things depending on how environment is defined, as well as what particular competencies we are hoping to support in students. Next slide. Our second key finding centers on why we see this association between open and positive climates and civic outcomes. While we include work by Deanna Kuhn and others that has described how learning environments can be structured to support reasoning, much of the research that we cite focuses on what we might conceptualize as the outcomes of civic reasoning and discourse opportunities, as opposed to the reasoning processes themselves. However, even in this work, there is an implication that climate matters because open climates provide opportunities to hone civic reasoning and discourse skills. In other words, open climates provide students with opportunities to form and share opinions, and to encounter points of disagreement or argument in appropriately supported and scaffolded ways. Beyond this, and as described in the last slide, is the acknowledgement that effective climates provide opportunities to demonstrate the value placed on this reasoning and discourse in ways that can connect to informing real issues encountered in classrooms, schools, and communities. Beyond the discussion of social issues in pedagogical contexts, this could include involving students in setting the ground rules for discussion within classrooms, involving them in leadership and decision-making activities within schools, and/or providing opportunities to engage meaningfully with the community beyond the school. Next slide. So to this point in presenting key findings, we've been discussing climate as a characteristic of an organization, or as a feature of the school and/or classroom as a whole. However, as acknowledged in the beginning, we know that there's variability from person to person in how a single climate is perceived. Acknowledging and thinking about this variability gives us insight into what we know, or what we don't know, about the ways in which an open climate can support civic reasoning and discourse. On one hand, individual differences in experience and disposition may mean that some students come into the learning environment more likely to perceive it as open and supportive. In thinking about it this way, individual variation in perceptions indicates limitations in our understanding of how the classroom or the school as an organization can support civic outcomes. In short, this variability makes it difficult to say that a particular classroom or teacher has a good climate, or that this particular school has a bad climate. But at the same time, acknowledging differences in experiences within classrooms and schools might also provide important information regarding the effectiveness of the learning environment for all students. Without careful planning and efforts to counter, the climate of certain learning environments could silence or marginalize particular points of view, especially if those perspectives have been marginalized or underrepresented in the broader social context. In thinking about these dynamics, an understanding by educators of the role of positionality is key, particularly as related to the varied experiences in family and community contexts that inform the perspectives of youth engaging in discussions and the topics of discussion that they find most relevant. This variability in experience is ultimately a source of strength to the classroom, as it provides lenses or experiential frames through which to view common problems that might differ from those of their peers. However, these benefits cannot come to light if students do not feel that the broader environment supports their perspectives. While the previous key finding focused specifically on what it means that individuals experience their climate differently, this finding on processes acknowledges that these differences in experience ultimately mean that the ways in which climate supports reasoning and discourse also vary. The association between climate and a variety of civic outcomes has been found to vary by group membership. In other words, group identity serves in this case as what we would call a moderator of how climate promotes reasoning, discourse, and engagement. Within our paper, we provide several specific examples of this. For example, how the effects of climate varies, for example, by gender or by socioeconomic status, or in some cases by racial and ethnic group membership. The specific explanations for each of these specific findings are complex, but the take-home message is that the effects discussed in earlier key findings simply don't hold in the same way for every single student. Beyond these findings, which we largely derive from large-scale and quantitative perspectives, we also note in our paper that specific activities connected to these identities within schools can enliven the school climate, encouraging awareness, dialogue, and advocacy directly related salient identities. For example, we mention research on gay-straight alliances in schools and how these organizations serve both to encourage students towards civic engagement, but also to inform faculty on how to foster more inclusive classrooms. We also provide examples of students and youth of color in particular who, upon engaging in leadership activities or discussion groups, report perceiving their school climates as less fair, acknowledging, for example, the disproportionate rates of suspensions experienced by Black male students in their schools. This provides an example of how students can apply the critical awareness developed through involvement in specific activities, maybe specific learning environments subsumed within the broader school, to become increasingly cognizant of inequities inherent within the broader context of the school. In sum, these findings indicate how experiences within a learning environment interact with one's own background and one's salient identities in order to inform civic development in unique and important ways. And with that, I turn it to Chris for the second half of our presentation.
Thank you, Carolyn. In our paper, we talk about how climate is contextualized and how educators have to act within these contexts. Oftentimes, these contexts present barriers to establishing learning environments that are conducive to civic discourse, reasoning, and engagement. Although there are potentially many barriers to these civic skills and dispositions out there, for our conversation today, I'd like to put a couple questions in our mind about institutional priorities and how teachers act in the context of schools and classrooms. Our panelist, David Campbell, will often talk about the ethos of a school. And for those of you, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to be a student-teacher supervisor, but probably many of us have had the experience of walking into the school and having the hair stand up on the back of our necks or sensing a disturbance in the force somehow that, schools that might have a certain vibe about them. I've been in schools that focus more on which side of the hallway students walk down to get to class rather than what civic skills they are learning in that class. And so there really is, in such cases, very limited freedom for teachers to act in those contexts about how they are going to promote civic engagement and civic agency on the part of their students. And so I would like us to think, where do these vibes come from? And perhaps are there examples of positive vibes that we get from certain schools? I don't want to focus on the negative so much, but are there examples that we should hold up as exemplars of what a good ethos is or what a good vibe is? So where does this come from? Certainly, state and administrative policies bear some responsibility for the ethos of these schools. If teachers and administrators are worried about raising their math and their reading scores, or even building knowledge on civic tests to do well on civic tests, generally they have less energy to devote to raising students' civic skills. The consequences related to state funding and teacher evaluations, they create environments where anything not extensively tested is crowded out, regardless of whether or not the teacher aspires to promote discourse and reasoning over rote learning. So what levers do we have, both as teacher educators, as members of public organizations, or the NAED, to offer incentives to teachers or offer encouragement to teachers? So that's another question I would like to put out there. Clearly saying that research says this stuff is good for students might help a bit, but it doesn't quite have the same weight of raise this score or you're fired. So we have to take that into consideration as well. And so perhaps some of us here today have insights as to how we can pull those levers and how we can do that encouraging on our part. Another element is that there are societal pressures that shape how teachers act within their context. Teachers have to balance a lot of things in the classroom, and giving students space to exercise their reasoning, their civic reasoning and discourse in the classroom requires a certain amount of risk in regards to those factors. If we ask students to civically reason, we are inherently accepting the risk and the possibility that they might reach conclusions that we rather they didn't. Or parrot views that might be harmful to others in the classroom, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You do have to remember that sometimes we're dealing with young children who don't necessarily understand the broader historical context of the things that they say in the classroom. I would recommend to you a recent book by Levinson and Fay, who wrestled with some of these dilemmas, particularly in the present political context, about students saying things to other students like build the wall, or other actions that might be considered against the norms of civic discourse, or what William Galston earlier kind of referred to as non-starters for deliberation, or attitudes that really have no place in our deliberative landscape. And so I'd like us to wrestle with the issue of how teachers should balance concerns such as the need to discuss societal issues openly with that need for a safe and productive learning environment. There's also the risk of how people outside of the classroom will react to what happens in the classroom. The specter of parent and community complaints seems to loom large in research on teachers who want to have civic discourse and reasoning in their classroom, and these concerns certainly shape how teachers construct environments for discourse in their classes. To some extent, I recognize that fears of sanction based on a parent or community complaint or reaction to a lesson is a real concern, but I do also wonder how often these actors become a sort of boogeyman that teachers can invoke to justify their avoidance of these risks, and to kind of give in to that apprehension a little bit. And so one of the things that we don't see teachers doing that research encourages them to do is to, for example, model how they formed their political opinions, what is often called in the research as political disclosure. That, while you certainly don't want to say this is the right way, this is the wrong way, by modeling how you came to an opinion about a political or social issue, teachers can provide an important example to students who are developing their own capacities to reason about civic issues in their own ways. And so thus, how do we understand teachers' responses to these classroom environments, and what is within our power to do to help calm these fears or these anxieties, or help moderate these risks? We're going to move on to some gaps in the research about learning environments that we noticed when we were looking at particularly formal learning environments, but some adjacent environments as well. The first of which is for a paper on civic reasoning, discourse, and engagement. The most frequently researched of the three is the last on the list, engagement. There is very little direct measurement out there of discourse and reasoning skills as they pertain to different learning environments. I will highlight that one of our panelists, Deanna Kuhn, is a notable exception to this with her work on developing argumentation skills in various contexts of interaction with fellow students. It also seems to us that there is only so much overlap and cross-sighting between the various methodological schools of thought when it comes to climate or learning environments. We do find that there is precious little dialogue across methodologies of quantitative and qualitative work, and even less mixed methods work in this field. It is one thing to measure how a school or a classroom climate impacts students of various identifications, but another to measure how these students can be empowered to shape the learning environments around them. We found little research focusing on the student empowerment angle as well, and we would like to see more about that. And then lastly, age is an issue that we don't see much research on the civic discourse and reasoning of younger students. And so we would like to encourage researchers to also include younger students in addition to the middle school and high school students that are typically researched. Some more broader recommendations based on these, and so forgive me if I repeat myself a little bit. First of all, we have to recognize that social context and society itself are in flux. Norms change, communities change, and researchers have to keep up with that and recognize that the contextual and temporal nature of their findings. We would like to see elements that acknowledge political and social challenges, particularly how injustices and inequality and movements to redress both injustice and inequality are shaping educational contexts. School and community interactions can also shift with changing times and situations. More attention to how these interplays occur would help researchers understand how teachers and students act within and in relation to their communities. Learning environments themselves are often an evolving term. Recently, we have an influx of potential digital environments. This current coronavirus scare is forcing us to reckon with how do many colleges have digital learning environments using Zoom or other technologies to replace in-person classes? But we should also think about digital discussion spaces or digital learning platforms. I know we have someone from iCivics here today. So how do learning environments such as those shape students' civic discourse and reasoning and engagement? As we've said before, students have unique experiences and perceptions of their learning environments, and research must address these. Of particular importance is to address the reciprocal nature of many of these individual elements as they relate to learning environments. For example, peer interactions can shape perceptions of school and classroom climate, and conversely, educational experiences can shape peer interactions. Similarly, the classroom climate may develop the skills of discourse and reasoning, but then the increased presence of those skills in the classroom will in turn affect the classroom climate. Lastly, recognizing that in the process of civic reasoning and discourse, that students and teachers are not purely rational beings is important. There are emotional elements of learning environments, and it is important to understand and research how these affect how environments are perceived. And one connection that we thought that isn't really found in the literature is perhaps connections to the field of social emotional learning may have much to offer researchers as they try to explore these elements. And it's also true that research operates within a context, and sad to say, some of the contexts for research currently are not supportive of educational work towards civic discourse and reasoning. For example, the U.S. has not participated in international studies of civic education since 1999, and funding for large-scale research endeavors in civic education typically lags behind that of other fields, such as math and science, even within educational research. Advocacy and the development of research infrastructure is key to countering these trends. One example might be the CivLeads website run by the ICPSR out of Michigan, where they collect data relevant to civic education and engagement and store it for secondary analysis. And so our final slide today is recommendations for educators. So if we want an ethos of discourse in our schools and classrooms, we have some suggestions based on our review of the research. The main conclusion is that it needs to happen in as many facets of school life as possible. So what might that look like? Naturally, you have to have civic discourse and reasoning in classrooms. It must be modeled by the adults in the classroom and practiced by students, and preferably in activities where they're collaborating with each other rather than just envisioning an imaginary other with whom they're reasoning. If students are to learn about civic engagement, discourse, and reasoning, they must engage in discourse and reason with other people. Further, these opportunities should not be restricted to the classroom. School governance and extracurricular activities, for example, should provide opportunities for students to develop reasoning and discourse skills outside of the classroom. Students themselves may be able to research these climates through youth participatory action research. Administrators, in addition to using their influence to support and promote these opportunities, should also be taking the lead in explaining the necessity of these activities to parents, school boards, and community members. They must also examine the impact of school policies, such as discipline policies and testing policies, and understand how they shape the learning environment. Now, if you're like me, this all may sound lovely, but also aggravatingly vague, and perhaps bordering even on naive. And so the reason for that is that we have to acknowledge that research, and there is research pointing to a couple reasons why that is the case. The first is which, as we've noted several times, a variation in how students perceive schools and classrooms. Their experiences and their identities make it difficult to anticipate what specific measures a teacher or an administrator might take to promote civic discourse and reasoning. On top of that, variations in communities and broader contexts of schooling provide, in a sense, a moving target for what actions and issues are going to be controversial, what will provoke a political response, and what is perceived as relevant to the students in the classroom. Thus, as a final point to introduce for discussion, I'd like to think about how we get around what we could probably call the "that won't work here" problem that teachers often say, oh, that won't work here. What can we do to make civic discourse and reasoning available to students in all schools, and how do we translate our ideals into concrete recommendations for practitioners? What supports can academics, professional organizations, and other actors provide to these teachers? So thank you for your attention, and we're going to turn it over to David Campbell, who is our discussant for today.
Well, let me begin by complimenting the authors of this paper. This paper is a truly masterful synthesis of a vast literature across multiple disciplines. And I just want to emphasize the fact that they were reading stuff from a variety of different disciplines that you might think share the same language and theoretical constructs and such, but they really don't. And that's no trivial thing to try to decipher, you know, what a psychologist means by something when the same thing might be said by a political scientist, but in different language. And then you've got education scholars who might be working in their own terminology. So that itself is a major contribution to the literature in civic education. So a lot of what I'm actually going to say today is less about the paper itself and more about what we can learn about this area of research and what is yet to be learned about this area. I'd like to suggest that the study of climate at the classroom and the school level is a lot like many other social scientific theories that we have. I'll use as an example, but I could have chosen others, contact theory. So that's the basic idea that when people who are different in terms of race or ethnicity or religion or language, if they mix and mingle with one another, a greater sense of tolerance is fostered. It's been around for a long time. Most people sort of believe that intuitively, even if they've never actually read any research in that concept. Well, the preponderance of the evidence, of a vast literature on contact theory, is that there is really something there. The proof of concept has definitely been established. But we also know that it is not simply a matter of just always throwing people who have lots of differences together in any environment and it always produces good things. In fact, actually, sometimes putting people who are not alike in some environments does not produce a positive outcome, but can lead to negative outcomes. In other words, it's kind of complicated, and you have to sort of understand when is it best and when is it not to put people in contact with one another, and how should that happen. Well, I think we're at a similar point in trying to understand the openness of classrooms and schools. It surely can't be that all forms of openness are good for every civic outcome in every context. And so I think it is now incumbent upon those who are interested in this question, and there are many across many disciplines, to try to understand, well, what kinds of openness and what settings for what students have what effects on what civic outcomes. This paper does a nice job of highlighting those complexities, because even if you read just a small sampling of the vast literature that they are drawing on, you'll see that it's a complicated world out there. But I'd like to distill from that vast complexity two big questions and then suggest some next steps. So one of the big questions that looms over this whole area of research is the extent to which the relationships that are observed in study after study between an open classroom or an open school environment and civic outcomes, to what extent are they truly causal? That is, it is the open climate that leads to these civic outcomes and not the other way around. And the reason that I highlight this is there's this nagging doubt that hovers over this literature that the strongest correlations are always between an individual's perception of the openness of their classroom or their school and the individual's level of civic engagement or whatever the civic outcome might be in that particular study. That is, when you ask individual students, is this classroom sort of an open place for your ideas? And they say yes, that individual student is more likely to then be more civically engaged. If, however, you look at aggregate level measures, so not what the individual thinks of their classroom, but what everybody else thinks about the classroom, the correlations are either weaker or sometimes they aren't even there, which hints, does not necessarily prove, but it hints that maybe it's not the climate that leads to the civic engagement, but it's that the civically engaged students are the ones who perceive the more open climate, or they are the ones who are more likely to speak up in class and believe that the teacher is listening to their comments. Now, I'm not suggesting that just because you find that individual level relationship that it might not be causal. It might very well be. But it might not be, or it might be for some students, or some students in some situations. Again, it's a complicated world, and I think in this literature, this is an issue that needs to be grappled with more seriously than I think it has been. Secondly, and this is also very nicely highlighted in the paper, I think we also have to grapple with the possibility that there are cases where openness, or at least openness in the way it's traditionally and conventionally defined, might not empower all students. In fact, there might even be some students who, again, in some situations, in some environments, might be disempowered by what well-meaning teachers believe is an open climate, either at the classroom or the school level. So that leads to what's next. Again, not so much about this paper itself, which I think has captured what's out there in terms of the scholarship on these questions, but rather what we should be looking at for the future. Because I'm actually a little less convinced, I think, than the authors are that we currently know what the best practices ought to be. No, Christopher signaled that, well, maybe we aren't so certain, but nonetheless, here they are in the paper. And I'd just like to suggest that there are some areas of further exploration that should be embarked upon before we draw any conclusions about best practices. So here are at least 4. First, I think there needs to be far more research on the actual effects of open discussion of controversial issues. And while this is not the only methodology that could be employed, this particular question does lend itself to experimentation, which does not even necessarily have to happen in a classroom setting. You could imagine other settings where you have young people engage in discussion of issues, moderated perhaps. And that would give us an opportunity to observe who engages in the discussion. Just a simple question, well, who is more likely to participate in that discussion? Under what conditions? Does it matter if it's being moderated or not? What sorts of moderation might lead to more or less discussion from students? And what happens to students who are members of marginalized groups? And it's from that sort of work that perhaps we could scale up into the classroom in order to figure out what the best practices are in a classroom setting. The second area that I would encourage more work on, more attention to, is marginalized groups. Now, this is definitely highlighted in the paper, but it's worth noting that we know a lot less than we probably should of what happens in the real world when there is discussion of controversial issues in the classroom. How do marginalized groups react to that? Now, marginalization might include race and ethnicity or in religion. It might include your status as documented or not, but also, just to pick up on a theme from one of our earlier panels, class. And this is an example, again, where these small-scale experiments that I'm envisioning might inform research in the classroom to know where to look and what questions to ask. Third, This paper looks at both what happens at the classroom level and at the school level. And it nicely distinguishes between those two because they are not the same. But I would suggest that the differences between them, what happens in an individual classroom, what happens in the school as an institution, can be further explored. Now, this is an area of research that probably doesn't lend itself, at least not easily, to randomized controlled trials. But it could benefit from careful case studies or surveys or some combination of the two. The challenge would be to disentangle classrooms from schools. On the one hand, it is likely that most schools that have a participatory ethos will also have classrooms with a lot of open discussion. However, it is conceivable that there could be open classrooms in schools that as an institution are not very democratic or participatory. That strikes me as actually a fairly likely scenario and something that would be worth exploring. What happens when an individual teacher goes rogue and introduces these practices in a classroom, even if it's not in a school where you'd expect to find it? Fourth, I would like to suggest that we can build on the work of Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy on controversy in the classroom. Again, as Christopher mentioned in his remarks, there's a lot of discussion about the extent to which teachers face opposition from parents or even administrators to have the open discussion of political issues in the classroom. But I don't think we really know how much of that is teachers' perception versus actual incidents. A lot of this is anecdotal. And if we understood more of, well, how much of this is perception, how much of this is reality, it would actually help us understand where teachers feel that they can engage in these practices. And that in turn would help us understand where this sort of civic education is taking place, which might lead to recommendations on how we can better facilitate classroom discussion. I myself have had personal experience with this a few years ago. Some years ago now, I went and did a little session in my daughter's 5th grade class on how the Electoral College works. And this is right in the midst of a presidential election. And I was worried that if I talked about the actual election that I would get somebody upset. So I came in and I brought in plush toys from the, if you know Arthur, the television programs. I had Arthur and Francine, and they were running for president. I did this whole thing in the Electoral College. But these little 5th graders were not fooled for 1 second. They were fully aware that I was talking about an actual election, and all they wanted to talk about was the actual election, and everything went fine. It was a lesson to me that sometimes perhaps we worry a little too much about what gets injected into the classroom. But that's one case. Another anecdote, my suggestion is that that's something that needs to be studied far more systematically, so that best practices for an open classroom and an open school become a norm, so that administrators will protect teachers who might face opposition from parents because they are engaging in evidence-based education. So I'll just conclude by saying the bottom line is that this excellent paper has demonstrated that there is this large and growing body of research that is converging on some common conclusions. And I would also suggest that this collective body of scholarship currently is in a sweet spot. There is a seedbed of previous research, so scholars working in this area would not be lone voices in the wilderness, but there's surely a lot yet to be learned, especially to understand the conditions under which open and school classroom climates foster those positive civic outcomes, and we should not forget that this is important too, when they do not necessarily facilitate positive outcomes. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Carolyn or Chris, did you want to respond, or did you want to move on to audience Q&A?
I have a very quick response. And first of all, David, thank you so much for your comments and for your feedback. I wanted to address one of the areas of further exploration just very quickly, and that is the kind of interaction between the individual classroom context as well as the school context, both as kind of layers of this learning environment within formal learning environments. On one hand, I would say that probably the reason why it feels a little separate is because a lot of the literature is quite separate. As David, I'm so happy to hear the recognition of kind of the variety of different sources that were pulled for. And I think the distinction between talking about this as a classroom feature and as a school feature is another really good example of that beyond the disciplinary perspective and beyond the methodological perspective. Not to say that there aren't individuals who don't look at intersections, but in working with this, it felt to me like very different literature basis. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for thinking about kind of the interaction of these levels. There were a couple of areas that I think began to focus on this. I'll give two examples, one from more the large scale quant perspective, and then one from more of a case study perspective. As a function of the kind of measures that are in some of the IEA data sets, there's some interesting work featured throughout the paper that talks about, I mentioned the idea of moderation before, and the ways in which the associations between like a classroom climate and particular outcomes is sometimes stronger or sometimes weaker, depending on the extent to which students report that they feel that students' voices are valued within the school more broadly. There's a lot of different folks who have looked at that in a lot of different groups of students, as well as different outcomes, but that interaction, I think, is an interesting part that is in many of the studies, in some of the studies that we focus on. Going to the exact opposite part of the methodological spectrum, I really like some of Scott Sater's case studies of civic character, of schools that do an exemplary job with civic character missions, and the extent to which he talks about and provides examples of the way that this is seen through the entire administration, as well as the ways that it plays out within specific classroom environments, I thought was a really great example of that. Bonus that this is an environment that focuses not only on adolescents, but also on younger students in the ways that civic character looks at earlier grades. So I think there are some interesting examples there. None of them quite get at the question, which I think is a fabulous one, in terms of when there are areas of disconnect, particularly when a teacher does something really extraordinary in less than ideal conditions. But I just wanted to point that out, and both the challenges we saw there, as well as the potential places where we might see some of that within our work.
Great. I also wanted to bring in Diana Kuhn, who raised her hand, but she's also a member of the panel, to provide her perspective. Diana?
Hello?
Yes, we can see you.
Yes, you hear me? Okay.
We can hear and see you, yes.
Great. Okay, Diana Kuhn. And I guess I should start by introducing myself a bit as a relative disciplinary outsider. Though I've certainly heard enough use of the terms reasoning and discourse here to feel that I have a role to play. My training is as a cognitive and developmental psychologist, and who's become more and more focused on education. But for the last couple of decades, I've focused on the development of inquiry, argumentation, discourse. How do they develop, particularly in the second decade of life, the critical one, and what are the outcomes of this development? And I'm referring very broadly here beyond skill to the development of dispositions and values. And indeed, going beyond to my earlier work on education for thinking, which you can see where that comes from, my most recent book, I've in fact written directly to young adolescents, Building Our Best Future, in which I try to engage them in the value of collective discourse by appealing directly to them. And indeed, we do see development, and I would suggest that to this group that it is particularly important to look for this development in the epistemological domain, because what we see in adolescence, the most typical stance is this multiplist, why argue, why discuss stuff? Everybody has a right to their opinion. And indeed, this is the development that social studies educators really need to work on. That yes, everyone has a right to their opinion, but some opinions can be more right than others to the extent they're supported in a framework of alternatives and evidence. And I have recently gotten quite interested in social studies as a school discipline, because I see it as an ideal context for this development to occur. And furthermore, that it's one that is not yet fully realized. From everything I've read and observed now, it seems that in real world classrooms, teachers are pressed to even get to much of what we're talking about here today. They're, to a greater or lesser extent, what they need to cover is mandated, and if they get through history of what was, they're feeling take a breath of relief, and maybe get to what is today in terms of government structure and so forth. But then the year is over, and there's rarely time to get to ask kids to what in today's world they really need to be thinking about of what could be. These are the ways things have been done. Here are different ways to think about how humans can organize themselves and live together. So one of my hopes in being involved in this panel is that the report ultimately will incorporate practical considerations of what's really going on in social studies classrooms, and help to see how we can help to realize more fully this potential of a standard curriculum subject. We don't have to invent a new one. I've sometimes taught argumentation in fact, in middle school as a freestanding subject. But here we have social studies, and how can we help use it more profitably as a context for the kind of thinking, the collaborative and individual that students desperately need to be doing. Okay, so that's my personal hope. Let me just say two more quick things because I know time is short. And both of these are emphasized already in the paper, but I just want to underscore how important they are. Yes, indeed, what should we do has already been nicely highlighted as the ultimate focus of civic engagement. Yet it's human minds that need to be the central pillar between civic education and civic outcomes. Individual and collaborative sense-making need to be at the center of the whole enterprise if we hope for it to be sustained beyond some initial enthusiasm or interest that kids may show. Engagement depends on understanding of purpose and meaning. We need to make sense of what we engage in doing. And so I see that as really the critical mediator of much of what we're talking about. Second, and lastly, civic outcomes of the sort we have been talking about are not restricted to external actions. outcomes, importantly, include understanding and certainly values. And this was referred to earlier of sort of the new identities that you acquire through this kind of participation as ends in themselves and not simply as mediators for civic action. So that we need to keep in mind that broad purpose of what I've long called education for thinking. Okay, let me stop there and give others some time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deanna. And I know Chris wants to make a response.
I just want to provide a quick response to both Deanna and Dave's comments that they both highlight to me what's very important is the need for civic educators in particular to draw on disciplines outside of the educational field. That one of the things that David mentioned in his comments were the need to examine various moderation of discussions, various examples of who participates, and all of these variables that could affect how a discussion goes. And that's research that has, in many cases, already been done on adults in the deliberative democracy field in political science. I'm thinking off the top of my head of some very interesting work that Chris Karpowitz and Tali Mendelberg did on gender and deliberation and manipulating the group membership, the size, the decision rules. And so there's been a lot of work in those fields that I think civic educators can benefit from looking into. And the same thing relevant to what Deanna was saying is that, the fields of psychology are decades ahead in understanding how people operate. And sad to say that I think civic educators are operating on a model of how people work, so to speak, which is not universal, of course, but that came about in 1776 rather than one that is relevant to 2020. And so I think that, just to emphasize the point of that not cross-curricular, but cross-disciplinary work can really help us as civic educators in trying to, inspire our own research on students.
Great, thanks, Chris. We have two questions, one from High Bass and then from Jennifer Morton.
Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you.
So one thing I was puzzled about in the discussion was it spoke about the classroom. There was no mention of subject matter. There was maybe a presumption that we were talking about social studies or history. But I want to draw attention to the relevance of this to mathematics or science or other classrooms. And in fact, even whether the discourse and reasoning are practices which vary interestingly across subject matters, but I suggest that maybe they are all relevant to civic discourse. The phrase, what should we do? It doesn't seem to apply directly to discourses which are about knowledge production or critiquing of knowledge claims, but in a way they do. And it's part of civic discourse is to understand for a particular issue what type of reasoning and argumentation is appropriate and relevant, and even to frequently discordance arises from the fact that they're using two different incommensurable kind of frameworks for the reasoning and trying to reach some resolution. So my question is, to what extent was the work of this group conscious of or sensitive to subject matter distinctions in their work?
I can begin by answering that. I would love for Chris to chime in. I'd love for Deanna to chime in particularly. I would say that from a very kind of practical perspective, it is true that what we see in the literature currently is primarily situated within civics or civics-related courses. So I think you're absolutely right in that the knowledge base from which we're drawing is most likely not considering the context of a mathematics classroom. I would say that that's something that was kind of on our minds, or at least on my mind as we were writing, in terms of knowing the extent to which some other papers in this panel really focus on the role of various subject matters and subject matters as related to civic reasoning and discourse. And just given the nature of our literature base, there was maybe less to work with, but a really interesting eye out for how other papers were able to take this on. As a very small case in point, and I apologize for continuing to go back to large scale surveys, as Judith mentioned, that's kind of my bread and butter. There was a recent, or not recent, 10 years ago, change in the way that the open classroom climate items were worded to move away from civics related classes to classes in general. To the best of my knowledge and from my work with those data, I haven't seen any really notable changes that have come about from that adjustment in terms of what we see or what we find or how it works. But I think it is kind of an interesting one to say, well, yes, we acknowledge that this is broader than only a civics course related issue, and yet we're starting from a literature base and a knowledge base that is very focused on that. I think that's why the school-wide work is so great as well, because that's something that will kind of be overarching regardless of any class, but I'll leave it to others to chime in further.
Great, and I noticed on the chat box that Alan Schoenfeld has also made a comment about incorporating some of the literature from their paper, particularly around dialogic teaching. And Carolyn responded. So I think going forward, some of those interactions will be made between the two papers, one foreshadowing the other. Next on my list, we have Jennifer Morton.
I thank you for this great presentation and paper. I just wanted to pick up on a theme that I think was running throughout the presentation, and I'm not sure it was explicitly stated, but when you were talking about the barriers to civic discourse and to an inclusive climate, it seemed like some of the barriers were particularly barriers for teachers having a lot of agency in their classroom. So testing, feeling like these external factors that mandated and curriculum and so on. And so I was wondering if it would be helpful, I don't know if you have to have a separate section, but just to think about the teachers and their perceptions of the classroom and their sense of their own agency as civic actors and as civic players within this sphere, and not just as kind of moderators, but really civic actors, because it did seem like some of the factors that were getting in the way of the students really seeing the school as a
Okay, it looks like, unfortunately, Jennifer, it looks like it's a network issue on your end that your internet froze up. Maybe we'll move when she comes back. Hopefully, we can finish that question. Oh. All right. Maybe if you could send a note to her about that, and we'll move.
Thank you. So I think for me, I think I'm going back to the point that was raised earlier, that we still wanted to make sure we think about the connection between these papers to the classroom and to the schools. And I think if I put my teacher hat on, or even my principal hat, I think it's a few different things that popped up in my mind immediately that maybe can be addressed. So I think the moment we started talking about school climate, and I thought about what's the demographic makeup of the schools, and I didn't hear what those were. So I don't know, like if you're in schools that are typically populated highly with students of color, then the behavior plans or the discipline policies tend to be different than schools that are predominantly white. I was in a traditional neighborhood school in Chicago, but I was also in a selective enrollment school in Chicago. And the way the teachers and the principals interacted with the students and the parents and the community was completely different. The way the school district interacted with me was completely different. So I think when the idea of an open environment, I would almost not have the unit of analysis be the student and not think about the student's engagement with the adults, but thinking about whether or not the school is prepared for students who are different than people may be accustomed to working with or teaching. And then I also think you get into, we talked about this earlier, issues around identity, even understanding that we know how kids' identities are formed by how the society and individuals react to them. And so I think understanding that, what's the role of the adults going back to preparation? Teaching leadership preparation. What's the role of the adults and those who are expected to prepare those teachers and those principals to really have those capacities and skill sets that they can then pass down to teachers that could be infused in the classroom? And again, I don't think we can move away from issues of oppression, issues of power, and issues of inferiority when we talk about how students might react in environments if they're given an opportunity to speak or to talk, even issues of gender in those environments. So I think with all that being said, too, there's a lot being discussed now around implicit bias and issues around suspension and expulsion. And I would ask that you incorporate the voice of teachers in this discussion, because there may be some differences in how the work is interpreted from a teacher's perspective or even a school leader's perspective versus the perspective of the researcher. And so just really trying to connect that research to practice, I think is a spot that's very important. And I think it's blind spots on both ends. I think when I was a teacher, I didn't understand the research. But then when I went and got my doctorate, I was like, okay, I see why I didn't understand the research. And so now I'm trying to think of ways to bridge that gap between the classroom practice and what's happening in our institutions of education, and really think how we can connect with each other across the aisle, because the work of both is important.
Great, thank you. And I'm also going to read Jen Morton's question, which actually builds on what Frank was saying. But to what extent, or to help think about how teachers see their own agency as civic agents in the classroom, and to what extent the barriers to student learning are also the barriers to the teacher as civic actors. So I don't know if Carolyn, you wanted to just respond to that, or, I also am very familiar with the space. I think there certainly is teacher data, both from a quantitative perspective, that maybe could be brought into this question. And also some cross dialogue with Diana Hess's paper on teacher preparation might be good.
Greg, absolutely. Though that's a fantastic point, and you're absolutely right. I think that we were focusing primarily on the perspective of the students and keeping a lookout, particularly with potential interfaces with the pedagogy paper is a great way of moving forward, and B, might explain some of our hesitancy to put it in our own space as well, even though it sounds like there are ways of putting it in specific to climate. In addition to what I think part of what Greg might be referencing in terms of availability of data around the teacher perspective, I'll also mention in particular that I think that there is some work that we have been incorporating and been kind of working with around the ways in which organizations/activities within a school setting and students who engage in those activities through leadership opportunities, through more kind of empowerment-oriented organization activities might, I mentioned these in my comments earlier, use that experience to become more critically aware of the broader school context around them. And several of the pieces that speak to that focused particularly on using either qualitative or quantitative approaches on the experiences of students in schools located in the urban core with high numbers of youth of color, and in the process of describing the settings of those studies, focusing in particular on the disproportionate rates of suspension experienced by African American boys in the school in particular. That still, though, A, is only a small part of the research, and B, again, focused a lot on the experience of the student as opposed to the teachers and as opposed to the other adults working within that climate. And I think that that's a really great point to take in, particularly if we're making the argument that the ethos of a school includes the perspectives of the adults as well as the students. So thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Next, we have Jan Brennan from Education Commission of the State.
Thanks. Chris mentioned the need for better understanding about student empowerment perspectives, and that's what I just wanted to say is that, you know, definitely the students are cast primarily in a reactive role, and so I'd love to see further development of the sense of student agency in cultivating and creating civic-friendly climate. Definitely there is a little section where you talk about, it's almost going the other way, that there's sort of a correlation. You see students in more managerial roles, meta talk, that kind of stuff. But I think the other relevance of that is that we've talked a lot about civic skills and discourse skills. And so, you know, to what extent do we need to think of climate building skills as civic and discourse skills, you know, in which students need to develop skills in creating norms, shared norms. Students need to develop skills in creating student voice, those kinds of things.
And one of the things we found, just in quick acknowledgement of that, is that one of the places where that becomes very important is in the extracurricular activities. And that, for example, Carolyn mentioned gay-straight alliances in schools and how those have become opportunities for student leadership and for students to actually, and here I'm thinking of J.B. Mayo's work, where students are actually changing the practice of teachers or influencing the practice of teachers when they talk about creating inclusive school climates. But there are certainly other opportunities for students to lead within the classroom. And we don't see a whole lot of literature on that, but I think it would be interesting to do a specific dive with that in mind to see what comes up.
Okay, great. And then we have our last comment to end this part of the program is Carol Lee.
So first I want to keep reiterating that the scope of the entire project, so if we think about the topics, the issues that you all raised about conditions in climates of schools and classrooms that facilitate, excuse me, discussion of difficult topics related to civics issues, is that we want across the papers and the broader message to be, and this sort of in part goes to Hyman's issue that he raised, is the conditions in classrooms, schools, what's entailed for both teachers and young people to engage in the discussion of difficult topics that have some relationship to broader societal goals, as not what simply happens in civics classes. So some consideration of what does this look, how might these supports potentially look similar and different across classrooms, in an art class, in a science class, in a literature class. Second, that there is, certainly in my field in literacy, a substantive body of work on discussion and facilitating discussion and use of mixed methods for analyzing
both supports for and opportunities for what unfolds in discussion. And I think figuring out for us, for the cross panel, of thinking about how do we connect threads across papers, because some of the issues that you raised are issues certainly in our paper that we talked about. Excuse me. And finally, that one of the things I would like to end up doing, part of my hat as panel chair is trying to think about what are some sort of a kind of glue or sets of glue sticks, if you will, that provide threads across the papers. And so this question for both teachers, what are the challenges and opportunities for teachers to design such instruction and for students to engage in such instruction? And what do we know from various disciplines and psychology and learning sciences and social psychology, et cetera, that would help us understand what those challenges are. So some of those challenges are relational, some of them are knowledge-based, some of them are identity-based. And what are the conditions? This is why, again, I keep going back. We were just talking in the break about understanding issues of conceptual change. I was thinking, Frank, is that your name? That there are schools in which inviting students to talk about topics that are highly controversial will elicit emotional responses on the part of students, teachers, administrators, and parents that can be very conflictual, or ways in which, even around this notion of discourse, ways of communicating. So most of my work has been in African American classrooms where students with adolescents who speak African American English. And I show videos of these very heated discussions, and teachers look at them and think, well, there's terrible things going on. These people are not listening to each other. But the students are deeply engaged because their modes of argumentation are completely different. So it's, I think, some way for us to figure out how to sort of map out that territory and then think about how does each paper potentially contribute to our understanding of the whole of the problem space, rather than assuming that each paper needs to take that on. Also, I might add, just around this issue of discussion, the McDonald Foundation is putting a lot of money into supporting projects, all of which are working on issues of classroom discussion. They've just funded their second round. So I'm working with Susan Goldman from the University of Illinois Chicago as a co-PI on a project that we've got funded on discussions in the discipline. So we're looking at it in terms of subject matter. And we got a nice piece of change to do that work, but we're only one of a number of, so there's a lot of work going on right now.
Okay, great. And again, in our participant list is Carolyn and Chris's emails, along with Judith. So if anyone has any further comments after this workshop, feel free to email them as they work to continue and revise their paper. So I think we ended almost exactly on time. We have a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back for our next panel, which is on digital literacy.